The Shadow Chancellor joins us ahead of his speech at Labour's Alternative Models of Ownership conference to tell us more. Good morning to you. What are the alternative models? This is just nationalisation, isn't it?
No, we've made it very, very clear we don't want to return to that sort of centralised bureaucratic nationalisation of the past. In fact, people like me never really supported that sort of model. What we're looking at is much more about how we manage our public services in a devolved way, where you bring together, well, representation from passengers or consumers, the workers themselves, and expert management with democratic involvement, particularly through local authorities. And in that way, you manage the service not for profit, but for the basic of delivering the service on the basis of local people's needs. In that way, you don't have this draining of resources in the way you have, for example, in the water industry, where £18 billion worth of dividends have been paid out to shareholders over the last 10 years, whilst bills have gone up and actually the service has declined.
But that model of public ownership, we think back to the 70s when the prefix British in front of things like British Rail really was a byword for substandard late trains. You know, don't tell me you don't remember the stale sandwiches. It hasn't got a good track record. You do remember the sandwiches.
A lot of that is myths as well, I have to say, because more... I do. I'm old enough to. But if you look back on some of the more objective assessments, even of British Rail, actually in comparison with the investment that went into British Rail, in comparison with the rest of Europe, it was pretty efficient. But I don't want to go back to that sort of management. What we want to do is devolve it. And as I say, in some of these instances, not on a not-for-profit basis, it's happening already. In Wales, water is supplied on a not-for-profit basis. Across Europe now, there's literally about 800 examples where local municipalities are bringing public services back into public ownership, but manage them in a way which is much more cooperative. I want to move from the dominance of the shareholder into a more stakeholder model. In that way, I think we'll become more efficient, certainly more democratic in terms of the control of this, but also I think we can deliver the service more effectively at lower cost.
But why is it such a bad idea for the private sector to take on some of the liabilities? That way, that completely reduces government debt.
Yeah, but you know, that was one of the arguments that was put to us, that if you privatise these services, you'd also shift the risk from the public sector, from taxpayers, to these private companies. But we've had the same problem as we had with the banks. It's a thing called moral hazard, you'll remember, where basically the risk, when these companies fail, the risk comes back to us. We saw it with Carillion. We're seeing it now on Virgin on East Coast Line, which the franchise failed. It was brought back into public ownership. It ran for a couple of years very efficiently and paid money to the Treasury, got reprivatised, and now it's failed again, it's having to be brought. So we seem to be bearing the risk while the private companies take the profits.
There has been obviously a lot of public scrutiny, you're right, over private finance deals. But with your model, what would the cost be?
Right. It would be cost neutral. The way in which we do it, take water, for example, Well, let me just explain. What we would do is we would take control of it. The shareholders would get bonds. We'd borrow for those bonds. That's what bonds are. But the profits that we would make, because these are profitable operations, it would cover the cost of that borrowing. But in addition to that, the profits levels would enable us then also to reduce bills. I give the example of let me use this metaphor if you like. It would be like when you go out, you buy a house. You buy a house, say in London, average price £500,000 now, unfortunately. You'd get a mortgage, you'd buy that house, you'd then rent it out. The rent would then cover the borrowing costs of that mortgage. And in fact, you'd most probably make a bit of a profit where you'd be able to improve the house as well. That's the sort of model we'd use. This is happening right the way across Europe and other parts of the world because privatisation has failed so badly.
But with that model, you'd have nowhere to live if you rented out your house. Coming back to the bonds, how much would you borrow?
But this is a commercial operation.
How much would you borrow, though?
Well, this is a commercial operation. Well, for each industry, the price would be set by Parliament itself, as has happened in the past in nationalisations. You wouldn't speculate on that cost now, but whatever the cost would be, it would be cost neutral because the sector that you were taking into public ownership would deliver the profits, would enable you to cover the costs. So it would be cost neutral.
But you must have
that's
a
the
ballpark.
Office of National Statistics and it's international.
You must have a ballpark figure because people watching at home will want to know where are the pound signs going, a round ballpark figure of how much it would actually cost.
It would be cost neutral because you would be bringing into public ownership an asset. In addition to that, you'd not just have an asset, that asset would give you income, and instead of that income going to shareholders, it would come to the taxpayer. And you'd then decide, do you reduce prices of that service? Do you invest? Or do you bring it into the Treasury? My view is you do a combination of investment and reduction in prices. In that way, not only is it cost neutral, it will pay for itself to improve the service in the long term.
I think that cost-neutral idea is one that's quite difficult for people to get their heads around. I mean, if you are taking into public ownership companies that have been privately run, you are going to have to pay a cost, if nothing but compensation.
Right, let's go through this again, and I'm sorry if I'm not being clear enough, but it's straightforward this. It is exactly like taking out a mortgage. You take out the mortgage, and if you're taking out a mortgage to purchase something which is giving you a steady and good income, like all of these industries would do, you will cover your borrowing costs, but actually you'll then make a profit that enables you to invest back into that service. It is cost neutral. This is not me saying this. This is the straightforward accountancy rules of the ONS and international accountancy standards. The issue for me, and this is very straightforward for people, what we do now is instead of having £18 billion over the last 10 years in the water industry going to shareholders, that money will come to taxpayers and they will decide, along with consumers and workers and management, whether they reduce bills or whether they invest or whether they do both. My view is they'll invest and they'll reduce bills. And the recent research by Greenwich University said that on water alone, we're paying out every year an extra £2 billion. If we didn't pay that out in shareholding the way that's been going on in recent years, we would be able to reduce the price of water bills by £100.
So just to clarify, public ownership would cost absolutely nothing?
Exactly that. In fact, we believe, because we would manage it more effectively and we'd cut out this draining of resources by the shareholders, we believe actually we'd be able to reduce consumer prices and invest in the industry and make it more efficient.